Good to see you. Thanks so much for coming. We'll
Thank
just
you
go right this way.
for inviting me.
I met Sanchez in Washington, D.C., where she is the director for the Andes at WOLA, the Advocacy for Human Rights in the Americas. Gimena's work includes pushing for greater recognition of Afro-Colombians and protecting indigenous communities.
First of all, thanks so much for talking to us. It's interesting. I was reading your bio, and it's quite extensive. There's a lot there. But at the bottom of it reads this. Originally from Argentina, Ms. Sanchez's family was displaced during the country's civil war, fled to Europe, and subsequently moved to the United States. Can you talk to us about how that shaped you as a person and perhaps directed the type of work you're in today?
Sure, actually, it had a lot to do with it because I was somebody who was exposed to many different types of people at a very young age. So I come from Argentina, which is a country that believes itself to be mostly European, even though that's not really true. And it's also a country that has a long history of genocide of its Afro-descendant population. And so if I had grown up fully just in Argentina, I would probably have a very different mindset. But the fact that from a young age, I lived in different multicultural, diverse settings where there were lots of migrants from all over the world, in places like Paris and New York City, really exposed me to many different types of peoples and different types of lives that people have, and made me very conscious of how different people are treated differently. So it had a lot to do with my interest in these issues and subsequent work in it.
Sanchez is an expert on peace and internally displaced persons, human rights, and ethnic minority rights. Her work has shed light on the situation of Colombia's more than 7 million internally displaced persons and has exposed the links between Colombia's government and drug-funded paramilitaries.
I was at a gathering in Canada some years back, and it was indigenous people from all over the world. And you'd meet people from New Zealand and Norway, and obviously it was in Canada, so there was a lot of Canadian indigenous folks there. But the one thing that you kind of saw that was kind of the connective tissue for all of them was discrimination and trauma. And I want to ask you about that, and how does that feel in Latin America? And how do you get past that and breaking the chains of poverty that also are part of an ingredient of all of this?
Okay, well, in the case of Colombia, there's been multiple mass displacements, and this year the Truth Commission is actually going to come out with their report known as the ethnic chapter in the Truth Commission report, which will, in a sense, talk about all this. Because in Colombia's peace accord that was signed in 2016, there was a massive movement on the part of Afro-Colombian indigenous people to be included in the peace accord. And it was the first time in that accord that it was really recognized that the legacy of slavery, the legacy of colonialism, put Afro-descendants and indigenous people at a complete disadvantage when it came to the conflict. So then when you had the conflict, they were disproportionately affected. So for example, Colombia has over 7 million internally displaced persons, and more than about 3 million are Afro-descendant and indigenous. And given that they're not the majority populations, that's a huge amount. And so I think the first thing to know about these situations is that it's not something new, but it is something that is very rooted in that first displacement that happened for Afro-descendants, which led them to form, in a sense, their own parallel societies away from the urban centers, away from the parts of where they could be re-enslaved or what have you.
We've ended up with culture wars here in the United States over much the same thing. What should be taught in schools and that sort of thing. I mean, is it going over as well there, or is there pushback?
Oh, it's going terribly, I would say. Yeah, it's not going very well because it's not seen as important. It touches on people who are, I guess, the more dominant race or the more elite race that is getting a lot of benefits. So in the case of Colombia, most of the areas the Afro-descendant indigenous people live are very rich in terms of natural resources. And I'm talking about mining, forestry resources, biodiversity, all sorts of minerals. And so the approach to those areas has been to have national companies or companies from outside of those areas come in and forcibly take those lands or take those natural resources. And this has been done in a very violent way. It's been done with paramilitaries. It's been done with the help of the military and paramilitaries, and so accepting that the situation that people are in those areas, in terms of poverty, in terms of not having access to services or having any access to those riches, means accepting the responsibility for what is causing that situation. And so people don't want to talk about racism because it opens up that whole can of worms. And they want to let go of what they've gained from that, and they much less don't want to be held accountable for it or questioned.
In Colombia, indigenous leader Jose Comayo was assassinated in January of 2022. Comayo was a member of the Nasa people and one of the founders of the Indigenous Guard, an unarmed collective of land defenders. The community blames FARC dissidents for this murder. Among those involved in the attack is a man accused of murdering a 14-year-old indigenous Nasa environmentalist earlier this month.
It's interesting. I saw a talk that you were giving about some of your travels in Colombia, and you go to rather remote areas that are not where everybody goes on vacations. And you were talking about, this is a country that was racked by conflict and thousands died. And you were talking about post-conflict areas which had mechanisms to protect civilians, but you're seeing problems, a shifting of dynamics. Can you talk about what you're seeing and how race plays into all of that?
Sure. Well, I was just recently, 3 weeks ago, in Chocó, which is in the Pacific region of Colombia. Predominantly, it's a state, they call it departments, 90% Afro-descendant, in an area, like I mentioned, where a lot of people fled to after being brought over through Cartagena and what have you. And in that area, you currently have multiple groups operating. So on the one hand, the guerrillas were treated and demobilized. However, other groups that were present that the current government has made no effort to address, which are successor paramilitary organizations, another guerrilla group, a secondary guerrilla group that this government has refused to dialogue with or what have you, are very much active in those areas. They control those areas because they control the licit and illicit economies. So these groups sort of diversify their economies. If they're doing stuff on the drug trade, they will also extort or charge taxes for every other legal economy in those areas. And the military's there, but the military does nothing. The military, you see them right there, you see them next to these groups, and whenever they are asked outside internationally what's going on, they don't do anything. They didn't see them. There's no proof. And that's not the way they operate in all of the parts of Colombia. So I think that corruption and collusion is particularly bad in those areas because of the overall thought that those areas are not important. Those people there are not as important. And so a lot of that dirty activity takes place and facilitates those abuses that take place in those areas.
Along with traditional healer Ufanchi Obu Kasu, Gimena has created a series of live stream shows to discuss the issues that Native communities confront in the region.
It's interesting talking about the Americas and the connection with the United States of America. George Floyd became kind of a touchstone, you were telling me.
Yes.
Talk to me about that and how that has kind of changed the conversation in Latin America.
Okay, well, it changed it in two ways. One, I think it broke this myth that the United States was somehow more of a post-racial society, I guess, as some have used the term, and reminded the Americas that no, the United States still has severe schisms on racism and a lot that needs to be improved and changed, right? So on the one hand, I think it surprised Latin Americans because they didn't think that was such an issue anymore. On the other hand, it all of a sudden made people in those countries sort of think about, well, what about our own people here? And exposed a bit more, raised awareness of the movements existing in Latin America that have been there for a long time, but just didn't get the same level of attention. And those movements started saying, like, Black Lives Matter here too, just, La vidas negras importa, they started using some of those slogans to raise awareness of the racism and discrimination issues that they've been dealing with in their society for a long time.
And it launched a TV program that you're involved in weekly, right?
Yeah, so myself and a human rights activist from Minnesota who's Afro-Latino started putting together these panels with different Afro-descendant activists in the region. So from Garifuna people, from Honduras to Afro-Brazilians, to Afro-descendants in Colombia talking about these issues. Because one problem that you have in Latin America is that it's such a taboo issue in a way. Either it's we are not racist in any way because we're all the same, or we don't talk about that because we're superior than the United States. We're not like racist like them, It makes people not talk about it. So we wanted to have those discussions. Racism isn't just the police brutality type racism. It's also the everyday not being able to get employment or being judged and seen a certain way or not as capable, or the exotification of women, or treatment of Black women as somehow being easy or horrible, things like that. It permeates on so many different levels. That is really what we wanted to discuss, and how that's linked to violence and linked to policing. Policing in Brazil is very problematic and very disproportionately the abuses take place against Afro-Brazilians. We also had other issues like militarization. In Brazil, northern Brazil, you have a U.S. military base that was built in an area of Quilombola peoples. So Quilombolas are Brazilian peoples who are Afro, who have collective territories. And Bolsonaro wanted to increase this military base to build a space program. And so doing that would mean displacing people who are Quilombola from that community. And so, the idea that it's U.S. based, but it's this idea of militarization and its impact on Afro-descendant peoples. Everyone knows about the Amazon and how there's takeover and land grabs of indigenous territories, but few know about how it's impacting these Afro-descendant territories that have the same kind of cosmology with the earth as indigenous people, which in most of Latin America, you see that. Like the Garifuna people consider themselves Afro-indigenous. In Colombia, indigenous and Afro-descendants have communities that live side by side because a lot of the cosmology in terms of the natural environment, taking care of the flora, the fauna, the animals, being sustainable, are the same way of living for both populations, basically. So that's what we decided to talk about.
During the last weeks of January 2022, armed attacks by alleged outlaw groups have caused the death of 3 human rights defenders in Colombia's Nasa indigenous territory. That's according to the Association of Indigenous Council of Northern Cauca. In response to the attacks, tens of thousands of people protested in the streets of Cali.
But that rage, I imagine, must stay with you on that flight back to the United States. You're coming back to the heart of all of it, Washington, D.C., where, you know what it's like in this city itself. It's like attention spans are all over the place. This is not something that people are focused on.
No.
How do you get that on the agenda and get them thinking about that?
Basically, we bring the very people from those areas to tell policymakers directly what's going on. So recently we had 2 Afro-Colombian leaders, from those areas, and they're like, look, people are committing suicide in this region of Chocó because they don't want to be recruited by the illegal armed groups. And the military is right there. So why isn't the military stopping the guerrilla groups from forcibly recruiting youth and that kind, that's basically the way we do it. And then in non-pandemic times, we've taken members of Congress to some of those areas, although it can be hard because of the security situations. But I don't think you can do it any other way. You can write a report as long as you want, but it's not the same as the people there telling you this is what we're living and this is what's going on.
Yeah, these are really important.
Yeah.
Well, what about, we've talked a little bit about it. Maybe you can dig just a little bit deeper, this rural-urban divide, and how does that really contribute to racial discrimination?
Well, in a situation where people are living in different bubbles, and it's not clear-cut rural urban, because even within the urban areas you have pockets of areas like you do here where you have marginalized people, and in the case of Colombia, a lot of them are displaced from these areas. So what used to be a country where people who were Black were concentrated in one area, indigenous were here, and then mestizos here, has now become integrated by force because of the displacement. So people see each other, but they don't relate to each other because their complete worlds are in this bubble. And so they only listen to the people within their bubble, within the schools that they're in, within the religious authorities that they have, And so while they may be having somebody right in front of them that's displaced from this region, their perception of that person is, oh, they must be a guerrilla, or something bad, or they're poor, or they don't have skills, they're ignorant, oh, they speak differently, so they're less educated, or that's not respectful, So I think it's more of an issue of the mentalities and the education that creates that divide than the actual physical closeness, of people. And I think that's what's most difficult to break, the idea that you're inferior to others. That's very complicated to break.
Well, it's been a great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.